Hello, I am Emily Rhodes, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Tales from Firozsha Baag by Rohinton Mistry, which is the January 2025 pick for Emily's Walking Book Club. I do realise I look a little bit eccentric wearing a hat indoors. I've just got in from being out and it is absolutely freezing outside. And so I'm keeping my hat on because I feel sort of chilled to the bone. Um, it's interesting being so cold and in such a cold place when reading this book, which for the most part is set in Bombay, which is obviously like really not cold. But there's this brilliant final story in it called Swimming Lessons, which is mostly set in Canada. And this there's a strong link of sort of migration from Bombay amongst this Parsi community, which tell you a little bit more about in a moment, and Canada. That's like the sort of, a lot of them have this dream to kind of make it to Canada, and the final story is told by this boy Kersey, who grew up in Firozsha Baag in Bombay and is now in Canada. And it gets really, really cold there, and the heating stops working out there, and he talks quite quite kind of poignantly about snow as it being this thing that he doesn't have these kind of childhood memories of snowball fights and snowflakes and things like that, because the only thing he knows about snow is what he read of it from an Enid Blyton books as a child. Um, so anyways, it's interesting, this kind of assumed knowledge that might be in a children's book that can also exclude the experiences of so many of its readers. Anyway, that was a bit of a diversion. I should tell you a little bit about this book. So it's made up of 11 stories. They're quite long stories as far as short stories go. And Rohinton Mistry then went on, this is the first thing he published, and he went on to write, I think it was 3 novels, all of which were, I think, shortlisted or longlisted for the Booker Prize. They're all brilliant, a fine balance. I absolutely loved. They're very long, his other books. I first read this, I think I might still have been at school or just after school, so a good 20 years ago or so, and absolutely loved it then, and I've loved rereading it. There are masses of characters in the book. So the book is all set in Firozsha Baag, which is this kind of complex of apartment blocks, mostly for the Parsi community. And there are some characters who kind of feature more than others. So there's a boy called Kersey who we first meet in one of the early stories. I think it's the second story, called One Sunday. And then it transpires that 3 of the subsequent stories are actually narrated by Kersey. Similarly, there's a boy called Jahangir. Sorry if I'm pronouncing these names wrong, by the way. Who is written about in an earlier story, The Collectors, and then narrates a later one, Exercises. And then there are other characters who just kind of crop up time and again in different stories, or who are mentioned in one story when they have a bigger part in another one. And I'm interested to know what you make of that, whether you find it a bit confusing. I have to say, I'm going to be completely honest, I missed quite a few of the links the first time round. In fact, the first time round in my recent rereading of it, so I suppose in my second time round. And I don't think I got that Kersey was the narrator for all of those later stories until it's like very subtly. It is the case that he is the narrator, but you don't notice it unless you look quite carefully, I think, certainly in some of them. And it's interesting because I think the fact that this is published as a collection of short stories, when I read it, or perhaps when you read it, you might think of each story as a thing in and of itself, something you can just sit down and read and it stands alone. And some of these stories have been published in other publications as their own thing. And I think they do all stand alone in that way. But I think it's then very interesting the way that they also have a relationship with one another, and that the characters do exist across different stories. And it almost makes me wonder if you could nearly describe this as a novel in some way. And it reminds me of that other book, Olive Kitteridge, which we discussed many years ago, which I think is the case that over here in England it's published as short stories, but in America it's published as a novel. And it's this thing that, yes, they are all stories, but the characters kind of move between them. And I sort of, on my rereading of this, read through it all once, and I was like, oh, hang on a minute, like, did I miss that? Who is this narrator? I'm going to have to read it again. And I went through it again very carefully. And I was so glad to have that second pass through and look at how they really do relate to one another, these stories. So I recommend doing that, a sort of double reading if you have time. It's very hard to pick a bit to read. I absolutely love this collection of short stories, and so it's hard to choose a favourite one. But I think one of my favourites is The Collectors, and so I'll tell you a little bit about it first, and then I'd like to read the ending of it. It sort of comes, you can see, sort of in the middle of the book. So I think the reason I wanted to read this out was because I think it really illustrates a theme or a sort of central tension to the collection, which is, that here is this very vivid community, where you really get a feeling that, here are all these neighbours, all the kids kind of play together, everyone knows everyone else's business, they're all sort of on top of one another. And with that community comes great support and sort of nurturing and help and feeling of togetherness. But alongside that comes a feeling of perhaps entrapment or imprisonment, judgment, and the kind of flip side of the good things about community. You know how I love community. And I think there's a feeling of sadness, very much so in the book, a kind of feeling of melancholy, of things going wrong in a way, and sort of things going wrong in spite of our best intentions, almost your powerlessness to make things go right. It's not quite as straightforward as that, and there's a lot of humour in the book, but I think I think that comes across in this story. So the main protagonist in this story is this boy called Jahangir. So he shows up in this story, and then he also narrates the later story. And Jahangir is a very quiet, effeminate boy. He loves to read. And he's often described as sitting on the steps of the apartment block reading while all the other kids are kind of playing quite boisterously outside, and so he's kind of picked on a bit, bullied. One of the sort of ringleader of the other boys is this kid called Pessy, who is the son of Dr. Modi, who is a vet. And Dr. Modi is another kind of quiet, gentle man, and we learn he absolutely loves collecting stamps and longs to sort of share this stamp collection with his son. But his son, there's no way Pessy would be into stamp collecting. And this difficult relationship between the father and son, there's this brilliant moment where it's described as, Pessy is the worm in his mango. So good. Anyway, one day Dr. Modi gets back in his nice car and he sees Pessy bullying Jahangir, and this prompts Dr. Modi to kind of take Jahangir in, and he then starts sharing his stamp collection with Jahangir, who absolutely loves it. So here is this instance of what could be a nice thing, right? These two quiet people coming together, sharing the stamps, sorting them out together. They start doing it every Sunday. But it leads, of course, it goes wrong, So, first of all, Jahangir gets into this fix at school with this other boy who he starts doing sexual favours for in order for him to sort of steal stamps for him, and then they get found out, and then he has to return the stamps, and then he's so ashamed he can't see Dr. Modi, and then it all comes to a head when this prized stamp of Dr. Modi's, this Spanish lady dancer, goes missing, and everyone accuses Jahangir, and even though he didn't steal it, he can't argue his case. So this all happens. Dr. Modi then moves away and dies of heart failure. And the bit I'm going to read out is after that. So it's right at the end of the story. And his widow, Mrs. Modi, who I should say hated these Sundays and this relationship between them, because she felt that Dr. Modi, her husband, was neglecting his own son in favour of Jahangir. So she really wanted to she tried to sabotage them, basically. Succeeded, in fact. Anyway, when I think it's about a year after he's died, Mrs. Modi really apologises to Jahangir and confesses that that she destroyed the stamp, the Spanish lady stamp, and she wants to give him Dr. Modi's huge collection of stamps. And she's saying, will you take it as a favour to me? So he goes round to collect it all. Several trips later, Dr. Modi's cupboard stood empty. That's where he stored all the stamps. Jahangir looked around the room in which he had once spent so many happy hours. The desk was in exactly the same position and the two chairs. He turned to go, almost forgetting, and went back to the desk. Yes, there it was in the drawer, Dr. Modi's first album, given him by his Nusawanji uncle. He started to turn the heavily laden pages. They rustled in a peculiar way. What was it about that sound? Then he remembered that first Sunday, and he could almost hear Dr. Modi again, the soft, inspired tones speaking of promises and dreams, quite different from his usual booming, jovial voice, and that faraway look in his eyes which had once glinted with rage when Pessy had tried to bully him. Mrs. Modi came into the room. He shut the album, startled. This is the last lot. He stopped to thank her, but she interrupted. No, what is the thank you for? You are doing a favour to me by taking it. You are helping me to do what Berger, that's Dr. Modi's name, would like. She took his arm. I wanted to tell you. From the collection, one stamp is missing, with the picture of the dancing lady. I know, said Jahangir. That's the one Berger uncle lost and thought that I... Mrs. Modi squeezed his arm, which was still holding, and he fell silent. She spoke softly, but without guilt. He did not lose it. I destroyed it. Then her eyes went moist as she watched the disbelief on his face. She wanted to say more, to explain, but could not, and clung to his arm. Finally, her voice quavering pitiably, she managed to say, Forgiven, old lady, and patted his cheek. Jahangir left in silence, suddenly feeling very ashamed. Over the next few days, he tried to impose some order on that greatly chaotic mass of stamps. He was hoping that sooner or later his interest in philately, is that how you pronounce it, would be rekindled. No, is it philately? I don't know, something like that. But that did not happen. The task remained futile and dry and boring. The meaningless squares of paper refused to come to life, as they used to for Dr. Modi in his room every Sunday at 10 o'clock. Jahangir shut the trunk and pushed it back under his bed where it had lain untroubled for so many years. So this is the trunk that he's storing all the stamps in. From time to time, his mother reminded him about the stamps. Do something, Jahangir, do something with them. He said he would when he felt like it and had the time. He wasn't interested for now. Then, after several months, he pulled out the trunk again from under his bed. Mrs. Bulsara, that's his mother, watched eagerly from a distance, not daring to interrupt with any kind of advice or encouragement, Her Jahangir was at that difficult age, she knew, when boys automatically did the exact reverse of what their parents said. But the night before, Jahangir's sleep had been disturbed by a faint and peculiar rustling sound seeming to come from inside the trunk. His reasons for dragging it out into the daylight soon became apparent to Mrs. Bulsara. The lid was thrown back to reveal clusters of cockroaches. They tried to scuttle to safety, and he killed a few with his slipper. His mother ran up now, adding a few blows of her own chapel as the creatures began quickly to disperse. Some ran under the bed into hard-to-reach corners. Others sought out the trunk's deeper recesses. A cursory examination showed that besides cockroaches, the trunk was also infested with white ants. All the albums had been ravaged. Most of the stamps, which had not been destroyed outright, were damaged in one way or another. They bore haphazard perforations and brown stains of the type associated with insects and household pests. Jahangir picked up an album at random and opened it. Almost immediately, the pages started to fall to pieces in his hands. He remembered what Dr. Modi used to say, "This is my retirement hobby. I will spend my retirement with my stamps." He allowed the tattered remains of Berger Uncle's beloved pastime to drop back slowly into the trunk. He crouched beside the dented, rusted metal, curious that he felt no loss or pain. Why, he wondered. If anything, there was a slight sense of relief. He let his hands stray through the contents, through worthless paper scraps, through shreds of the work of so many Sunday mornings, stopping now and then to regard with detachment the bizarre patterns created by the mandibles of the insects who had feasted night after night under his bed while he slept. With an almost imperceptible shrug, he arose and closed the lid. It was doubtful if anything of value remained in the trunk. So it's so sort of sad, isn't it, and futile. And I think I suppose it's interesting that as a reader, I really feel very sad about that. But that is a different feeling to what Jahangir is feeling. He's feeling nothing. He's not feeling sad about anything. He feels relieved. And again, I think in that there is just such a tension, isn't there, between, I suppose, time passing, and things changing, and rather than being, the sort of the sadness of the loss of tradition, of the end of this era and the sort of destruction of this beautiful memory, there's a relief, a freedom, a release, a sort of looking to the future, a future in which maybe he won't just see these other worlds through the stamps and collecting the stamps, but might be able to actually go to some of these places. So yes, I hope you enjoyed that reading. I'm really looking forward to sharing our thoughts on this book. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the book. I love it, and I don't normally pick short stories, so I'm really interested to know what you make of it too. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you soon.